allow me to welcome you on behalf of the Pourdavoud Center for the Study of the Iranian World and the Program of Iranian Study at NALC to the second lecture of the 11th Ehsan Yarshater lecture series at UCLA, held by my esteemed colleague, Professor Robert Rollinger. I promise it shall not be as long as it was last time, but I would have to nonetheless, for the sake of comprehensiveness, provide some details again. So for those of you who have been already listening to me, my apologies, and please be indulgent with me. For those who have joined us only today, allow me to offer merely a brief expose of the impetus for the creation of the Yarshater lecture series and some bibliographical notes on our eminent guest lecturer. The Yarshater lecture series were inspired by Les Leçons au Collège de France and endowed by the late Professor Ehsan Yarshater, among others at UCLA, Harvard, Yale, the SOAS, and the Sorbonne. They are delivered by a distinguished scholar whose work has lastingly impacted the Iranian world. Each series consists of 4 to 5 lectures on a single theme that is subsequently elaborated and amplified into a monograph. Those monographs shall be coming out and be published in the UC Press in a newly established series called Iran and the Ancient World. The lectures thus represent original research and synthesis in all aspects of Iranian studies, including archaeology and art history, as well as literature, the study of religions, and philosophy. Dr. Rollinger is Professor of Ancient History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the University of Innsbruck, as well as the co-director of the Institute for Old History and Ancient Studies, Ancient Oriental Studies, so Institut für Alte Geschichte und Altorientalistik, where he has held since 2005 the chair for cultural interactions between the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. He's a thorough product of the University of Innsbruck, having received there his MA with a brilliant thesis on the Herodotean Logos, his PhD with an unpublished work on the origins of historical thinking in ancient Mesopotamia, as well as completed his habilitation. In addition to his tenure at the University of Innsbruck, he has held a number of prestigious chairs and fellowships worldwide. From 2010 to 15, he was the Finland's Distinguished Professor at the University of Helsinki. In 2020, he was a Getty Scholar at the Getty Villa. And since 2020, he has held the Nava Chair at the University of Wrocław in Poland, where he heads the international project From the Achaemenid to the Roman Rule. He's also a member of numerous academic institutions and organizations, among them the Austrian Academy of Sciences, the German Archaeological Institute, and the Academia Europaea. Dr. Rollinger's scholarly interests are indeed wide-ranging and encompass the cultural expanse between the Aegean world and the ancient Near East, with a special focus on ancient historiography, the comparative study of empires, and the Achaemenid Empire in particular. In Professor Rollinger's work, the world of antiquity constitutes a connected expanse, a single tapestry which, notwithstanding linguistic and cultural specificities, the historian of the ancient world has fully to grasp and maintain as a backdrop against which more discrete phenomena are indeed explored. He is equally at ease with ancient Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium as he is with the empires of late antiquity, and has authored an oeuvre that is vertiginous both on account of its abundance and versatility. I would like to single out just a few of them. His classical monograph on the Herodotean narrative on Babylonia, that is the so-called Herodotus Babylonische Logos, is a must for all students of ancient history and exquisitely illustrates not only his ability to command over different literary traditions, critically to assess them or innovatively to synthesize them, but more importantly shows his grand and wide perspective on what constitutes ancient history and historiography in the tradition we just described. Other signal achievements include Professor Rollinger's work in conjunction with Professor Michael Gehler on a grammatology of empires, or the comparative study of empires, which has led to the publication of a noteworthy series called Imperien und Reiche in der Weltgeschichte. I would also like to single out the most recent publication of his most recent publication, The Prodigious Blackwell Companion to the Achaemenid Empire, which was co-edited with Bruno Jacobs and will undoubtedly serve as the new work of reference in the field. After a sweeping methodological introduction on Monday in his lecture today, Whither the Achaemenid Empire Towards a New Connected History of Afro-Eurasian in Antiquity, Dr. Rollinger will explore the history of the Achaemenid Empire as a powerful engine of transregional connectivity affecting all of Afro-Eurasia. Of import is not only the empire's capacity to boost dynamic developments, which may be qualified as an early example of globalization, but also its ability to sustain cultural individuation processes and tolerate autonomous political individuations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rollinger. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Rahim, for this very, very gentle introduction and for having the possibility to present to you a piece of my very recent research. You can see just how I'm going to structure my talk. After a short introduction, guiding you somehow into the topic, there will be two main chapters. The first one on transregional and proto-globalized exchange and trading networks in the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And the next one, the last one, will present to you some consideration on routes and borderlands in East and West. So let's start shortly with the introduction. As many of you know, if you have a look on proto-globalization or globalization in recent scholarship, you will find a kind of communis opinio that holds that Eurasian connectivity only starts with Hellenism, that the agents of this development are the Hellenistic, let's say Greek or Macedon kingdoms, and on the other side China as well. And that with the ancient Eastern empires in general and the Achaemenid Persian Empire in special does not have any relevance in this respect, has no agency as such. So in this view, let's say the construction of an entangled world of Hellenism is regarded as an entire novelty driven by Greek and Macedonian spirit. And I think, and I'm convinced that this view cannot stand new insights and new developments into the field, and also the sources, in my opinion, speak a completely different language. Before we move into the first chapter of my presentation, I want to present to you some general thoughts on how empires work and how they matter concerning the fact of connectivity, the fact of transregional entanglement. And I'm specifically referring to two publications of my dear friend Kai Ruffing, with a special focus on the Roman Empire, but also developing a more general view on empires as such. And I'm just picking out some leading thoughts which gain momentum also as the backdrop of my talk. So the first one is: empires create, foster and boost connectivity and entanglement. They create, as you can see, follow my talk, they create novel economic space, and this is important, reaching into the border zones and beyond. They create and foster and boost legal security. This is also a very important fact, as you will see immediately. They create new dimensions of economic demand, and they stimulate trade, including the border zones and beyond. Moreover, empires create products that generate status within and also beyond the empire. They create newly established trading routes and specialization in transport. They create new dimensions of long-distance trade, mainly organized as specialized intermediate trade, so creating a kind of chain of connectivity. They are characterized by imperial elites with economic interests and properties all over the empire, so somehow the glue that holds the empire together. And they create new perspectives on the world and beyond, new mental maps, if you want, for the inhabitants in and also outside the empire. Empires organize trade on an official and a private basis, so both developments can be observed, involving especially local elites and their specific agency. This is a very important aspect, as I hope to demonstrate during my talk. Empires concentrate military engagement at the border zones and towards the borderlands. That creates new forms of economic demand in these specific areas. They stimulate new forms of local agencies in the borderlands and beyond, and foster borderlands as special zones of encounter and economic activity. And finally, they tend to control rather people and movement than space, and they have an intrinsic interest in controlling and safeguarding trade, obviously by taxes and fees. So if you put these general thoughts of introduction together, three important main points can be highlighted. So imperial engagement considerably lowers transaction costs. I think this is also an important fact. And empires are generally agents of economic and social entanglement within and beyond the empire. And our concept of border is, if we have a closer look, just a topological construct created by new forms of social interaction at very specific zones. So, how are we going to approach this topic concerning the sources? This is a final important thought. Of course, there are texts, written documents, of course, which have to be analyzed accordingly. There are also pictorial documentations, illustrations, and so on. There is, of course, also linguistic evidence taking into consideration etymologies. There are archaeological remains. Geography matters, as I hope to show immediately, so the control of key routes. So these all are, so to say, in the basket of humanities. But then science also starts to play a more and more important role, and this has to be taken into consideration as well, with new techniques like ancient DNA analysis, liquid residue analysis, dental calculi analysis, and so on. So all these sources together generate a new picture which I wanted to show, which I'm going to show to you in the next minutes. So let's start with the first chapter. Transregional and proto-globalized exchange and trading networks in the time of empire, with a special focus, of course, on the Achaemenid Persian Empire, but also taking into consideration its predecessors, the Neo-Assyrian and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So we can observe this with the establishment of empire at the beginning of the first millennium BC. The process of transregional entanglement starts to accelerate, starts to gain new dynamics. And of course, these are the three empires already mentioned by me, and that start to control key areas of Afro-Eurasian entanglement. And these key area, of course, are defined by route systems. So the sea route plays an important role, especially, of course, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Persian Gulf. So the control of major harbors gains momentum. The predecessor of the so-called Silk Roads is of major importance, and the control of major sites. And also the steppe belt, which runs from the Manchuria to the Hungarian plain, and the access to this belt gains more and more important. Of course, there is a background of which a framework, a general framework, which has to be taken into consideration as well. And one major aspect, of course, of this new dimension of Afro-Eurasian entanglement is the development of horseback riding, actually, which starts already at the end of the second millennium BC, which new research has shown clearly, and which gains a completely new dimension in the first millennium BC. And as all of you know, the Persian Achaemenid Empire is deeply related to the development of cavalry units, of course, with taking into consideration its Neo-Assyrian predecessors especially. So one of the earliest examples testifying to a riding Persian, so to say, in median garment, as it has been generally defined, is this very famous inscribed Elamite seal with this famous legend of Cyrus, the Anshanite son of Thespes, and you can see the riding garment very well on this depiction. And the same is, of course, also true on many examples from the famous Apadana, the east stair, and the median delegation is just an example of the importance of this riding gear, which you can see here in these very examples. But this takes me to some general topics which exhibit this importance of transregional entanglement. And I want to start just with some thoughts on military equipment and technologies, of course, somehow related to this framework of riding gear that I have been just mentioning. An important archaeological site in this respect is this site of Yanghai in northeastern part of the Turfan depressions. And there is and I'm just referring to a very recent publication by Patrick Wertmann and his team on this important site, where in a tomb 127, as you can see here, a leather scale armor was unearthed, which is dated by radiocarbon dating, as you can see, between the 8th and the 6th century BCE. And this leather scale has been elaborated in a very, very sophisticated manner, as you can see. So there are more than 5,000 smaller scales and 140 larger ones that make up this important equipment that is reconstructed, as you can see it right here, and that has been interpreted by the authors in a very specific way. The leather armor has been connected to Assyrian infantry and Assyrian cavalry. We know a similar kind of armor from Neo-Assyrian reliefs of the 7th century, especially. You can see it here on the riding cavalryman and also on the side of the infantry. So both examples originate from the palace of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. Patrick Wertmann and his team stated a high level of standardization of military equipment across Eurasia, and they believed that the place of origin of this kind of special armor is the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This generated a huge debate, which you can easily follow up following this link. Especially Sean Manning has contributed to this debate, questioning this origin. And I think with very good arguments. I do not want to go into the depth of this debate, but just want to draw some general conclusion which are important for my topic. I think the place of origin of the armor remains indeed hypothetical, so we cannot decide where it originates, but it shows, together with the Neo-Assyrian reliefs, similar military technologies across the whole of Eurasia, and it shows also the acceleration of connectivity and impact via horseback riding, so you may say from the Middle East on the one side towards the Taklamakan desert on the other side. Let's move to space as the next topic of entanglement. If we just map the Achaemenid Persian Empire, put it on a map, we can see that it controls nearly all major regions, from which we know in later periods that they are key zones of transcultural, transregional contact. I think this is a very, very important fact. So I will explain this to you shortly from a map, which you can see here. So the control of Chorasmia is of utmost importance because it's the connector between Central Asia and the steppe belt. Sogdia is of utmost importance, for it is the connector between Central Asia and the Seven Rivers land in nowadays southern Kazakhstan. Bactria, of course, is a key region also connecting Central Asia with India. Gandhara is a key region for control of the Karakoram highway connecting the western Taklamakan with the Indus Valley. And the Indus Valley, of course, is a major connector from north to south and giving access to the Indian Ocean. The same is true for the development along the Persian Gulf. So we can see that beginning with the 6th century, main installations at the eastern border of the northern Persian Gulf start to be established, so that the route from the Persian Gulf, or the connecting route between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, starts to matter. So the control of these key regions, I think, is as such an important observation. But this is also true if we look on the west, where we can make the same observations. And I will also show it to you on the map, so that's easier for you to follow. Of course, there are the important ports along the Levant and along the Western Asia Minor on the one hand, but also Egypt plays a major role in this context for two reasons. The first one is, of course, giving access to the Red Sea, and from the Red Sea then to what we call nowadays the Indian Ocean, but also from the oasis of Shiva and Dakhla especially, generating for the first time what may be called a trans-Saharan route across the desert. So these geographical aspects already as such are important observations, but these can even be enlarged. As a recent publication by Sunil Gupta has shown, around 500 BC, the Bay of Bengal becomes to be integrated into a network that connected India, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and China. And he even talks about the chronological watershed of 500 BC, creating a Bengal interaction zone. But of course, within this work of Sunil Gupta, this is just taken as a regional phenomenon, and the Achaemenid Persian Empire is not mentioned by a single word. The same actually is true by a bunch of recent publications that are focusing on the development on trans-Sahara trade. So just giving you some examples, where it is clearly stated that around 500 BC, so around the same time period, trans-Saharan trade routes start to develop, and I will go a little bit deeper into this interesting topic a little bit later. Also here, the authors nearly do not take into consideration the empire as such, which is just in between these large zones, which is interesting as such, as you may imagine. So let's have a look at spices. Just some example. Cinnamon. Let's start with cinnamon with its two variations, as you can see here, Cinnamomum verum with its origin in Sri Lanka and South India, and Cinnamomum cassia with its origin in Southeast Asia. There is an important recent publication on archaeological work done in Israel on these important sites. You can see here Tel Kazile, Dor, and Kinneret, starting in the 11th and 10th century BCE, analyzing a sample of flasks with the remnant of cinnamyl aldehyde, as you can see here, which was used as giving flavor to an unidentified liquid, maybe mulled wine within these flasks. And this cinnamaldehyde is a clear-cut component of cinnamon, of course, and it shows the rather widespread use of this flavor within the Levant at the beginning of the first millennium BC. And this can be combined, of course, what we know from classical sources, starting with the 6th century BCE, so just in the time of the starting Persian Achaemenid Empire. So the earliest classical attestation we have for the use of cassia is a fragment of the female poet Sappho, as you can see here. And we have a broad attestation in the work of Herodotus in his third book, where he not only mentions cassia, but also libanotos, as a frankincense, cinnamon as such, and other examples of resin. So exactly if you take into consideration the time frame again, so we are just in that period of the 6th and 7th century BCE where the empire is flourishing. The same argument can be made for the citron, so Citrus medica, whose origins are, according to very recent research, the central Himalayan foothills. Citron has a very specific characteristic. This is this very thick albedo, which guarantees a very long shelf life, so it is a preferable product for long distance trade. And as you will see, the first attestation of this fruit in the West is during the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire in the 5th and 4th century BC. So the earliest really robust evidence is a site, a Persian royal garden at Ramat Rachel, dating to the 5th and 4th century BCE, where fossilized pollen of Citrus medica have been found. And also, even during the Persian Achaemenid Empire, we can see that this fruit, so to say, moves to the west, and we have in the 4th century BC evidence for its usage in Carthage in further to the west, and from there it then moves further on to the north of the Mediterranean, and very well attested during the time of the Roman Empire. So here you have again an overview on this development, the place of origin of the citrus, so the movement to the west during the Achaemenid Persian time, and then further movement from this area to Carthage. And as this list shows to you, so it's the earliest citrus fruit testified from Eastern Asia in the West, and this long history of citrus fruits moving to the West only ends with the mandarin in the 9th century AD. Pepper, of course, is another important issue that can be discussed in this very context. So its origins are Sri Lanka and southern India. And also here we have textual evidence from this probably pseudo-Hippocratic treatise on the disease of women, where pepper is combined or put into the context of the Persians, or of the Medes as the Greeks call it, as a remedy, a median eye medication called pepper, as you can see here. And in another passage, a very important one, it is said that this plant is called pepper by the Persians, and it is obvious, and it's quite easily demonstrated, that we are facing also an etymology from Sanskrit Pipali with an Iranian intermediary to Greek peppery and Latin piper. So again, the Persian Achaemenid Empire is the intermediary force that guarantees the movement from east to west. With vanilla, we have another example. Again, the origins are India and East Africa, and also in this case, recent archaeological findings demonstrate the importance of empires, of the ancient Eastern empires for the Western movement. There is a very recent excavation in the so-called city of David. So here you have the Temple Mount for your orientation, and here the city of David in Jerusalem, where 13 ceramic storage jars have been found in the Babylonian destruction layer, so before 586, so in Neo-Babylonian times dated. And of major importance in this context are 5 jars which show the rosette stamp impression, so it is clear that they originate from the royal domain of the kings of Judah. And they, as residue analysis clearly demonstrate, the jars have been used for the storage of oil and wine, And in 5 cases, it is clearly demonstrated that this wine was flavored with vanilla, indicated by the presence of vanillin, as you can see here easily, also demonstrating in this very case, so the movement of this important spice from the east to the west. Of course, we may contemplate about the roots where this takes place, and of course, in this very context, the route from southern Arabia to the north gains momentum, and this can be put even into a larger context. So there are findings of inscribed shirts with South Arabian script in Palestine, also dating into this period. And of course, there are plenty of evidence for this spice in the books of the Old Testament. And we have just been discussing before about the time of canonization, and it is clear that the major part of the canonization of the Old Testament took place during Persian Achaemenid times, so also this can be taken as an evidence for the time of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And there is another important text originating from South Arabia, which I mentioned shortly in my very first lecture. This is this Sabaic inscription, BL Nashik Damirjan 1, dated by paleographical reasons into the 5th century BC, so that would exactly be the time of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and it attests to trade connections between Saba in the southeastern part of the Arabic Peninsula and Achaemenid Syria Palestine. Of major importance is this itinerant merchant, Subhumu, who leads a caravan to the north, to Dedan via Gaza and then to Judah, where he crosses the sea to Kition in Cyprus. So you see a wonderful piece of evidence for this trade connections in the 5th century BC. So you have here the translation of the text mentioning all the major sites. So it is a clear established trade connection between Saba, the towns of Judah and Cyprus in the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. But it's not only about plants, but also Animals play a major role. The transfer of animals, a very famous example is the transfer of chicken, which has been investigated by 2 recent publications, also somehow giving a more clear-cut picture on the wandering of this animal from India to the west, as I will show you immediately. So from Egypt, let's say, to the Horn of Africa to the south, we have evidence for the presence of the chicken, of the introduction of the chicken from India. But if you have a closer look, so there is a temporal difference between these examples. We can see that the development exactly starts in the 6th and 5th century BC, so during the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, in this region of Egypt and the borderlands of the Red Sea, whereas the examples from southern Africa to the south of the Horn of Africa, as far as we know now at the moment, only date into the time of late antiquity and early medieval ages. But as the earlier examples show, the introduction takes place during the time of the empires in the first half of the first millennium. Then, of course, also pieces of art, motifs play an important role. And I just picking out one, in my opinion, very interesting, very intriguing example of what is called the quatrefoil. This pinnacle ornament on flowers, and if you don't know what I mean, I just give you a definition. From a recent and very, in my opinion, very important publication by Minku Kim, which I can only recommend. So here you see what I'm talking about, and I'm just quoting his definition: an ornamental design formed by a cruciferous arrangement of 4-leaf or pedal-like projections radiating from a mutual hub. So here you have the pedals on the one side, and here you have the hub in the center. And this motif clearly has its origins in the Middle East. There is plenty of evidence from the second millennium already, from Egypt and from Mesopotamia, and especially starting plenty of evidence for the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and later on. So this motif is popping up suddenly in China. It is a motif, a design largely unknown prior to the Mid-Eastern Zhou period, and it becomes a very popular design in the Han period, and it suddenly pops up spontaneously in the time of the 6th and 5th century BC. So that's again the time I am talking about, the time of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And I just give you some examples, important examples. One of the earliest ones is this example from the late spring and autumn period. So of the 6th century BCE, you have it here in the center, what I'm talking about. So from one of these famous bronze tripods of the late 6th and early 5th century. And you have another important early examples, and also the background of this examples I think is very, very intriguing, because it's part of these Tanglu horse frontlets. So it has something to do with the introduction of riding and riding techniques from the steppe into China. And it is also interesting that we find the earliest examples into a Chinese polity. This is the polity of Jin, which has clear connections to the steppe belt, as I will show you immediately. Some of these motifs are even part of a larger set of motifs that are also originating in the Middle East, as you can see from this wonderful example here. They are in sites, especially in this policy of Jin, made even on an industrial basis. And here you have this polity of Jin and its communication to the steppe zones, where in the 6th and 5th century BC these special motifs are popping up. Minko King concludes, I'm just reading out his conclusion, accordingly, the alleged introduction of the quarterfoil marks a revolutionary rupture from the ancien regime of ornamentation in Bronze Age China, which was dominated by animal masks and other zoomorphs. One needs to appreciate, regardless the grave import of this radically prodigious advent of a new design that has no prior history in Chinese bronzes or material cultures, end of quote. And he puts it into the larger context of the decline of the traditional socio-political order represented by the ritual vessels of the enacted rites, and what Lothar von Falkenhausen called the waning of the Bronze Age. So this would also be a perfect setting explaining this new introduction. That's what I already mentioned. The motif as part of a whole set of other motifs that have ancient Eastern origin. This is a piece, a ceramic mirror, again from this polity of Jin, late 5th century BC, with a cluster of ancient Eastern motifs, different animals, so feathered animals. You can see the ducks inside here, the aquatic animals, the fish, and the terrestrial outside, and our motif here in the very center. So a clear-cut Western Asian origin, popping up suddenly at the 6th and 5th century in China. Obviously, the Achaemenid Persian Empire has to play some role in this. How, again, Kim puts it, this macro structuring of Afro-Eurasia by the Achaemenids, and giving transregional exchange a completely new design and new development. Of course, we do not have to think primarily about the pieces of evidence that move from west to east, but there are other ones, maybe lost due to the special archaeological conditions. Of course, textiles must have played a major role in this kind of transfer of motifs from west to the east. Woolen rugs must have played a role as well as rugs that are called in later Chinese sources as Dadeng, which is clearly a loan from Middle Persian tab. So again, we have here an important intermediate role of the Iranian highlands, communicating between West and East during the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Another important piece of evidence, also just revealed by a very new publication, is the transfer of natron-based glass. Again, this you have the publication here quoted, where this natron-based glass is clearly originating from the Western Levant and can be attested now in the context of the 5th century BC in China. That's how that's how the authors of this publication reconstruct the trade route. So they do not mention the Achaemenid Persian Empire by a single word. It does not play any role within this publication. And they think, oh, this might have been Greek agency, and then, it must have moved from the Levant to the Greek world and then across the steppe to the east. So you can see how, the mental framework of explaining this, this fascinating finding that is here on the board. So, yes, you can read the conclusion by the authors, and as I said, the empire does not play any role at all. There could be, I could adduce other examples where this connection between the Middle East, the Iranian world, and China was put forward by recent research. I just put some examples here behind me so that we may touch this in the discussion, but it is much more than just the pieces of evidence that I have been singling out. Let's have a look at the roots and the borderland developments that are connecting, so to say, these Eastern and Western worlds by the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Also here, new archaeological findings give very interesting novel insights into this development. So we can see that in the first half of the first millennium BC, the Taklamakan desert gains importance. And there are two interesting findings. The first one, which I'm going to introduce to you, is this Jumbulak Kum, located at the southern border of the Taklamakan desert, and the other one, which I will show to you immediately afterwards, is located at the northern fringes. So these are the main routes of transfer across the Taklamakan desert. So one of the earliest examples we have is this Jumbulak Kum, and it's not surprising to you, I hope, that it is dated into the 5th century BCE. So it's one of the very first urban centers. It's an oasis capital with farming population based on an artificial irrigation network. This is interesting, with a lot of resemblances to the irrigation networks we know about from Central Asia during Achaemenid Persian times. It's the center of a densely populated zone, and you can see here a view on the city walls and the impressive makeup of the city wall of these sites. And obviously, according to the archaeological finding, it has connections to east and west, which is not surprisingly at all. It's herding goat, sheep, oxen, camel, horses, and it's also having common millet, barley, and wheat. So common millet, of course, takes us towards China, whereas barley and meat takes us towards the Middle East. So again, interconnecting these important zones, and it is for sure not by chance that this urban center is just coming into being, gaining momentum in the time of empire in the first millennium BC. It even has a predecessor. So here you see just one example of this irrigation network I have been mentioning. It has a predecessor at the northern fringes of the Taklamakan. This is this Koyuk Shahri site, so that dates from the 8th to the 1st century BC, a quite large one, as you can see here. It has 4 phases. As you can see here, at its center there's a large platform surrounded by a city wall, which you can see easily. And its heyday, so to say, is in phase 2 and 3, starting with the 6th century BC. So again, exactly in the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And it has a similar subsistence structure as we have seen just before in the case of Jumbulak, so domestic animals, crops that show connections to the Middle East on the one side and China on the other side. So again, interconnecting these important zones. But this is something that is not only happening in the very east, so to say, at the first glance beyond the Achaemenid Persian Empire, but the same is taking place in the very west, as recent research has been showing, and I have just been mentioning it shortly within my introduction, that the development of oasis culture, the development of trans-Sahara trade, which is thought to have taken place originally only in Islamic times, has its origins, as new research has been demonstrating, just at the middle of the first millennium BCE, when this oasis culture starts to move from Egypt to the central Sahara, to the Fezzan. And in the second half of the first millennium, it moves from the Fezzan area further to the west. I just show you some examples. Of course, these oasis centers are uneconomic without networks, so they need to be placed within a larger network, a trade network, interconnected network, where obviously Achaemenid Egypt plays a major role. And what you can see here, this is also of high interest, is that with this popping up of oasis centers, specific forms of artificial irrigation moves from east to west. This is what is called as fogeras in the Sahara area, these subterranean channels for irrigation, but they are as such just variants of the Persian qanats, which have been introduced into Egypt and move to the west. And everywhere where you can see an F on this map, this blue F, so testify for this movement of this specific technique across the Sahara to the west. So you see here in clearer detail the development I am talking about. So this is what the archaeologists call the Garamantian period in the first millennium BC, when the first examples of agriculture just date to the first half in the oasis in the first half of the first millennium, and the urban centers start to pop up at the middle of the first millennium, so just in the time of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. I've already been mentioning Egypt and the importance of Egypt, and of course I have to mention in this very context the canal project that King Darius I established, connecting the River Nile, the delta, with the Red Sea, which is a famous project, of course. And the major testimonies for these undertakings are 3 stelae. 2 are of a special importance. This is the first one, the stele of Tel el Mashuta, with a hieroglyphic text only that you can see. And the second one of major importance is this Kabred or Shaluf stele, which has a hieroglyphic text, as you can see on one side, and on the other side the trilingual versions of Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. And there is this major statement, which you can see here, following Rüdiger Schmidt's translation, which I'm going to read out to you. I just quote, "I ordered this canal to be dug from a river called Nile, which flows in Egypt to the sea, which comes from Parsa." So the perspective is the sea comes from Parsa. which is Fars, of course. So this canal was dug as I had ordered, and ships went from Egypt through this canal to Parsa, as was my desire. It is very interesting to note that also this canal project has, by recent scholarship, has not been taken as an evidence for transregional trade or transregional connectivity, but just as something where the great king wanted to show what he was able to do. So just interpreted in the context of an oriental and despotic empire, and a trade was thought not to have played any role at all. But if we put this canal project into a larger context, a completely new picture evolves. I have already been mentioning in the introduction that in the northeastern part of the Persian Gulf, starting with the 6th century BC, important infrastructural investments start to be established. There is a cluster of 3 palaces that are well known for quite a long time, but which have been researched in more detail recently. So around this site of Borazcan, as you can see here, and here you see the 3 examples that have been unearthed. And we also have textual evidence for this site, which is called Tamukan, and which are clearly connected with the river system with the Persian Gulf. So what we have here is a clear-cut evidence for the accelerating importance of the trade across the Persian Gulf or to the south, already starting in the 6th century, probably in the time of Cyrus and Cambyses. So this Tamukan, or the Borazcan, has been defined as an urban zone characteristic to Tazebite foundations, so like it is shown by Persepolis in Pasargadae, urban project of several square miles with many unbuilt spaces, and its background, of course, is the control of the Persian Gulf. So you see that you have similar investments in the west, in Egypt, taking the canal as an example, as well as the east. But there is more, there is even more. Of course, when we are focusing on Red Sea trade, we have to take into consideration the deep history of Egyptian Red Sea undertakings. And as we know also by recent research, there are 3 important ports on the shores of the Red Sea, which you can see here. Wadi al-Jarf, which is testified in a short period of the Old Kingdom. Ain Sukhna, testified from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom, and Mersa Gawazis, testified for the Middle Kingdom, showing that there have been, at least since the 4th dynasty, naval undertakings by the Egyptian pharaohs. And what is important, in this context, they mention a special type of ship. These are these cabinet boats. The first attestation, as you can see, is already in the 4th time of the 4th dynasty, which can be observed in this connection. It is, of course, connected with the trade with the land of Punt. And there are many other testimonies which attest to this important development. Just giving you one example is this famous stele originating from the Middle Kingdom. But that's not the most important point. The most important point is that we have already a tradition of Red Sea naval undertakings in Egypt starting in the 3rd millennium BC that moves from northern Egypt at least to the southern mouth of the Red Sea, and which gains new momentum, especially in the 1st millennium. And of course, I am hinting again at this imperial context. The importance of which I want to demonstrate to you. There is another piece of evidence which has to be taken into consideration, also originating from very recent findings. There have been become known a set of 6 monumental Sabaic inscriptions from this region of Bari, which is a region within state of Puntland around the Horn of Africa, excavated illegally in 2019, and which can be dated to the end of the 8th century BC, and that might be originally have been connected to this temple that you can see here. Here you have at least a few on 3 of these Sabaic texts that have just recently been published, as you can see here as well. And they mention for the very first time a Sabaic naval undertaking, a fleet of Saba in the text. This is the most important point. So that is moving along the coast of Eastern Africa and around the Horn of Africa. And of course, you have to imagine this on the map. There you have Saba, there you have this very, very, very first undertaking taking place in the 8th and 7th century BC. And another direction of this Sabaic trade is, of course, into the region of modern Ethiopia, which plays an important role. So there are clear commercial purposes as context of these trade ventures. The search for aromatic resins is, of course, to be seen as background of this development. It is the agency of the Sabaean kings, which is important in this context. And it is generally, I just mentioned this, very interesting, that the Sabaean exploration of the southern Red Sea and the Western Indian Ocean starts about at the same time as the Greeks and the Phoenicians start to explore the Mediterranean. Of course, and one may wonder, has this anything to do with the empires in between that foster this kind of development? But let's move back to the stele I have been mentioning. So the Maskuta stele is the most important testimony of what I'm going to hint at. And in broken context, it also mentions Saba 4 times, and the Lord of Saba. It also mentions Cyrus. It's a pity, unfortunately, also in a very broken context. And it also mentions this very specific cabinet boats, which we know very well since the 3rd millennium BC, as I have been just showing to you. There has been a huge discussion about the place names that have been mentioned in this Maskuta stele, especially the place Barsa, the city, whether it is Persepolis or another residence, which is also mentioned. We do not have to discuss this here, but the mention of Barsa as such is of highest importance because it shows again the direct connection to the Persian Gulf and probably Tamukan that I have been showing to you, as well as the importance of these very specific open sea vessels that are mentioned in the Kabrit stele as well. The text also mentions tribute. Of course, this tribute is something which is part of this imperial perspective where many items of trade are just labeled as tribute, as we know from many other examples from royal inscription of the Middle East. But what is even more important is this role of Saba, of course, which gains a specific momentum if we take into consideration these inscriptions from Bari around the Horn of Africa I have been mentioning. And this becomes even clearer if we take into consideration the current and wind situations at the southern Red Sea and the Western Indian Ocean. And the evidence is nicely put together in a recent publication by Horton, Boivin, and Crowther, and I just quote this: navigation out of the Red Sea was complicated as the seasonal easterly winds that connected to the southeast monsoon for the voyage to India blew up the eastern African coast, necessitating a break in the journey in southern Arabia or northern Somalia to await the change in monsoon. Direct sailing from Egypt to Eastern Africa was a lengthier process than from Arabia to the Gulf. So that means at the very same time you have let's say, appropriate wind situation to move out of the Red Sea, you have an inappropriate one to move further to the east. And that means that you have to wait at the southeastern region, that is Saba of the Arabian Peninsula, to get better wind conditions. But it's quite easy to move from the Persian Gulf to Saba and vice versa. And from this background, the statement of the inscription, the nautical perspective, the sea which comes from Parsa, is nicely explaining this specific situation. And it also explains why Saba has such an important role as intermediate station for the trade between Egypt on the one side, the Indian Ocean, and Parsa on the other side. So let's summarize. The Achaemenid Persian Empire is at the center of novel developments across Afro-Eurasia in the first millennium BC. We observe connectivity on all different levels. We observe connectivity and novel connectivity between Southeast Asia and Western Africa, new connectivity between East and West Africa, connectivity across the Sahara, as I have been demonstrating, connectivity between India and Southeastern Asia, connectivity across the Isthmus of Kra, so in the Bay of Bengal, connectivity along the steppe corridor, so really a new dimension of entanglement that can be observed with this empire, as you can see here in the heart of this development. I want to close with a picture from the wonderful exhibition in the Getty Villa. This fascinating piece of evidence originated not from the Persian Achaemenid, but from the Parthian time, about 100 BCE. And the explanation we can read to this piece of evidence runs follow. You can follow it behind me. I quote, "The statue was discovered on the island of Icarus, now called Failaka in Kuwait, at the head of the Persian Gulf, where the remains of a workshop indicate that the figure was made locally. Alexander the Great has established a trading post there to take advantage of the lucrative commerce from India to Mesopotamia." I hope to have shown that this development did not only start with Alexander the Great. Thank you for your attention.